Hello.
Hello everyone. Good evening, or good afternoon, depending on where you're watching. Hello, my name is Ariel Estrada. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am the producing artistic director of Leviathan Lab, and I am zooming in from the lands of the Lenape people here, now known as colonially as New York City. I am a middle-aged Filipino American man with black hair, graying temples, and a black shirt on. And behind me is a green screen of a brick pattern behind me. Uh-oh. And I'll pass it over to Joseph to introduce themselves.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I am Joseph Ahmed. I use he and they pronouns. And I am the creator and performer of Half Magic, which is one of the exhibition screeners here in the Mixed Asian Media Fest. I am coming to you from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, as it's currently known, which is also Lenape-Hoking, the lands of the Lenni Lenape. I am a mixed race person with light brown skin, long dark hair with a teal streak. I'm wearing a flower patterned shirt, and I'm sitting in front of a bookshelf with lots of different colored books and some childhood photos on it.
Thanks, Joseph. And again, you are here on Mixed Asian Media Fest's broadcast of a question and answer session with the wonderful Joseph Ahmed, creator of Half Magic, which I hope you all have watched because it is fantastic. And I just finished watching it this afternoon, Joseph, and it's just a wonderful piece, wonderful solo work. And I just wanted to start off with telling us the secret origin of Half Magic. We hear a little bit about it in the actual piece, right? But I'd love to hear just sort of more details about like how you came up with the piece and what was the day that you had to and I know this from my own solo piece that I'm writing, that there was a day when I could not write it anymore, and there was I remember the moment, and I'm wondering if you do too.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. I think this piece or some sort of piece around mixed identity has been sitting in me for a long time. I feel like I've been done like small little forays into it over the last 5 years or so, here in Philly in different like little work in progress showings. And I think in all of this, I was really, at first, I was more wrestling with sort of how I was seen externally, thinking a lot about how sort of the like vaguely ethnic label gets applied in casting rooms as an actor, and thinking about like, what that sort of meant for my identity. Um, and then I think when this piece in its current form really clicked in was a combination of two things. One was the support of Philadelphia Asian performing artists down here in Philadelphia who offered me an opportunity to do a mini residency developing work with them just before the pandemic started. And around that time in that year, I had been recovering over the last 2 years from the passing of my mother, which is talked about in the piece a good bit. And as part of that, I had ended up cleaning out my childhood home, again, talked about in there. And I had rediscovered the book Half Magic and reread it for the first time in a long time. And that brought me to remembering sort of the passages in it that are really problematic for a person with the last name Ahmed. And so the combination of these two things of like an opportunity to be working on this material and also having made this connection of like Half Magic both as this book that is actually really problematic, but also this phrase that felt really like wholesome as a mixed race person. I was like, oh, this is the kernel. This is like the jumping off point. So the title actually in many ways preceded this version of the piece.
For the folks viewing at home, if you don't know the reference to the book Half Magic, which is referred to in the piece, it was a book that was written, and Mr. Eager, what was his first name? I'm blanking.
Edward Eager.
Edward Eager, yes, and it was written in 1954. And boy, is it problematic. I read through some of those I read through that passage online, as well as, of course, seeing the passage spoilers in the piece, and your wonderful read of it, because it was so earnest and so filled with that sort of the same childlike wonder that you probably listened to it with when you first heard it the first time as a child. But of course, hearing it as an adult, I'm going to skip this question since we are on Half Magic. Wow, it's definitely a product of its time. And a lot of the commentary that I read online about the book is forgiving of
Mhm.
the ethnic stereotyping in the book, which is just incredibly problematic. They managed to offend pretty much everyone in Asia
In a few sentences,
in just
it's
a few
all of a sudden.
sentences. Exactly, just like one after the other, and it's like, and it's also played for laughs. I mean, which, as of course, Asian people and mixed race people, we know intimately, right, as being sort of the butt of jokes, and for our identity, for our characteristics, and the general consensus in all the commentary is that it's like, it's better to actually talk about this horrible racism, so it's brought up as points of discussion, and yet I rarely see it actually people when they do see these things come up, whether it be Half Magic or another piece from a problematic or a problematic passage from another piece at another time, um, another book, whether it be a book or a movie or any other piece of art, it clearly doesn't get addressed often, right? Because we're often in those spaces with the white folks who are presenting this work, right? Can we talk about this briefly about why that is? I mean, I think, well, I have some ideas, but what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think I'm a sort of two minds, right? Because I think that things like this super like Orientalist racist passage in Half Magic, I do think there's something like from a historical context of like understanding where those points of view were coming from and like being able to unpack what that says historically about that time and where people were writing from. But I think that there's a big difference between like that sort of like historical contextualizing and being able to have that when you're a person who's able to grapple with that, or if you're a child in a learning situation where that's really getting unpacked in a meaningful way, can be super great. I think that a lot of what I sort of like didn't realize until I sort of got into adulthood and looked back at the media I consumed growing up was that growing up in a situation where there were so few stories that were specifically engaging with anything like my identity, that sort of insidiously the only examples of heroes that I had were often white heroes, or at least people who weren't of my same identity. And then having this book that was like my mother's favorite book, there's an instance of like my own name, my own last name being the name of this villainous character in there, realizing that there's this subtle kind of dissociation that happens, that I saw manifesting in myself growing up as like being able to sort of gravitate to whiteness, to the comfort of whiteness, to the stories of whiteness that I had, and as not really having. It's a sort of strange thing about being mixed race, right? Is that like neither of my parents know what it's like to be my racial identity. I didn't have like really strong mixed race role models because of that blending of two different cultures and two different racial histories.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think you touched on it pretty accurately in the fact that the people don't get it because there's an empathy gap, right?
Mm.
And that they don't bring up the fact that this might be potentially painful for folks, or that or any of the or that even mixed race issues are an issue, right? They don't see. And this is true of both white folks and non-mixed race Asians or any other person of background, other ethnic or racial background. I think sometimes that there is this sensation of siloing or this experience of siloing, and they don't
Mm-hmm.
recognize that there is a definite experience. I mean, of being mixed race. I mean, I certainly, with my nieces and nephews, of course, our nephew are mixed race, and I see the struggles that they go through. Um, Interestingly, my brother and my sister don't, right?
Hmm.
But neither do their white white partners either,
Yeah.
right? And that's always frustrating because you would think that we have gotten a little farther, but clearly there's clearly there's still more work to do in terms
Yeah.
of like helping to bridge that empathy gap, which is one of the reasons I'm so happy for the Mixed Asian Media Fest.
Yeah.
And for those of us who are just joining us, again, my name is Ariel Estrada, and I am the producing artistic director of Leviathan Lab, a theater company here in New York City that provides opportunities for early career and mid career Asian American artists here in the city. And I'm speaking with Joseph Ahmed, the creator and performer of Half Magic, the wonderful show that's one of the featured exhibitions here in as part of Mixed Asian Media Fest. You just mentioned about the comfort of sort of retreating into sort of these white heroes, right? And it's very hilariously and painfully exhibited in your section with Harry Potter about your love of Harry Potter, right? And even with the problem, how problematic J.K. Rowling has become.
Oh boy.
Yes, oh boy, has she. I still so very much have wonderful memories of that book and the movies, but I personally felt a sense of also this cringing familiarity, right? And I guess the best way to describe it was the feeling of like being pounded into like a square peg being pounded into a round hole, right? Of of having these heroes that were definitely didn't look like me at all, and still trying to identify with them. Can we talk a little bit about that? About how does that feeling resonate in you, particularly as a someone who is mixed race?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like square peg round hole analogy is like a very felt experience for me in a lot of aspects of my life. I feel like a lot of what I've sort of like in trying to figure out what being mixed race is, or just like what the sensation of that is in my body, I have really identified like liminality, this feeling of not necessarily being other all the time, but of being between, as being sort of really core to what it feels like to be me. And I think that comes from a number of things. I remember like it's in sort of like talking about this project, one of the things I looked up was some like national data around census collection and whatnot. And despite the like rising number of multiracial people, and especially like mixed race Asian people, there's like actually a lot of people don't identify as multiracial or as mixed race, even if they are like factually that, according to how that data is structured. So I think there's this really interesting thing of that as an identity, as sort of a cultural signifier and force, we're still underdefined. And that means that there's this place of like, especially as a child, where there are these like kind of like connection points of like, oh, parents and these like pieces of media that are so meaningful. There's a need for something, right? There's a need to anchor in something. So I think for me, like especially in like Harry Potter and some of these other figures, I would find aspects of myself or things that I wanted to think about myself in them, and I would latch onto that, and I would just let go of the parts of myself that I didn't understand, that were too complex or didn't fit into that. And I think that it was hard for me to really see in the moment like what I was losing, right? It wasn't until later that I was like, oh, right, like identifying myself as like talking about myself as being white and identifying so strongly with Harry Potter, what opportunities did I miss to embrace other parts of myself, to be more intentionally like learning from my father and from his culture? He's a Bangladeshi immigrant. So yeah, I feel that like that misfit. I feel like a lot of times now as an adult, what I'm seeking is stories and artwork, and also like how to live my life in such a way that I am feeling like I'm finding like that hole that I just like slip into, right, where it's a square peg and a square hole, or if that like place for me isn't there, to try to find the people and the resources to create that.
And I think one of the things that you just described was sort of the process of, well, white supremacy and assimilation, right? There's so much pressure to conform, right, and to move into what is the easiest thing possible, which is basically conforming to whatever white supremacy says is the appropriate thing to conform to, right? And even if it is like incredibly harmful to your psyche and well-being. I mean, one of the most striking images to me in the piece, and again, I encourage, if you have not watched it, everyone, you should, because it's brilliant, right? That there is a wonderful image of you, and I'm going to try to not spoil this as much as possible for anyone who hasn't watched it yet. But with you and a box cutter and boxes, and I think. to me, it's one of the more powerful images in the show and heartbreaking. Um, how did you come up with that imagery? Because it speaks on so many levels, and not just in terms of identity, but like the societal norm. Speaking of white supremacy, right? In terms of, well, how we're boxed in.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
Right.
Um, that's a great question, and yeah, I mean, I guess I have to spoil the image a little bit, but I feel okay with that, which is like essentially I end up sort of as this creature inside of a box and end up cutting myself out of it, and that really, it feels connected to sort of two things for me. I think that there's the combination of the imagery in the performance of boxes being like somewhat literally this like these boxes of items that I had to handle after the death of my mother. They're literally just like boxes of possessions in filling a basement from like 40 years of living in this house, as well as this idea of like, right, of check boxes of like being on those forms and being like, oh, well, I get to choose one racial category. How fun.
Mm-hmm.
This again. What am I gonna click on this time? And I think what really ended up prompting that, because that moment just came out of sort of a moment of like play and exploration, was sort of a desire for and a feeling of rebirth or like self redefinition, which also feels sort of connected to both sides of this. The side of which, like, I feel like I've, to some degree, when it's not just crushing me, I feel grief and loss as being this rebirth, potentially, to have the potential for rebirth in it. And I see the ways in which, like, my conception of myself has been fundamentally changed by those shifts in my family. And also that there is this, like, there's this emergence that had to happen. There's this redefinition of myself that has been tricky and raw and kind of painful and is very much still ongoing. It's by no means I have by no means emerged fully from the cardboard box of my identity.
And I think that's
I'm working on, you know.
Well, I mean, there are a ton of boxes in that.
Yeah, well, there's always more boxes.
I mean, one of the things that I definitely it worked on so many levels, right? Because there's on one level there's the boxes that we compartmentalize ourselves in, but then it also worked as eggs in the fact that there's all this stuff to discover, / break out of, / break into, and it's lovely. I mean, in that every box has a different thing to discover, and also just sort of like the comparison of a box being the same thing as a book. Right, that there's always something to discover when you open these things, and sometimes you discover things you don't want to discover or do, or that you always find something out you need to discover about yourself, but it's not necessarily pleasant when you open those things. Again, just a brilliant image and so effective. What I loved about it too is how the story could only, this is a story that could only be told by someone of mixed race, right? And that, if I tried telling this story, it would not resonate in the same way, because I think, and let me know what you think about this, because I've done this for a long time, because I'm quite I'm Generation X, let's just put it that way, right? And one of the things we consistently hear in sort of the Asian American theater scene, right? In fact, one of the most there's a relatively famous anthology in the early days of the Asian American theater scene. I think that was called In Between Worlds, I think, right? And that seems to be a ongoing thread throughout a lot of sort of early Asian American theater, right? Just sort of that feeling of being in between worlds, right? But it was always from this standpoint of always being othered, because you are like physically othered by sort of a majority culture, right? Whereas one of the things that I'm really interested in hearing from new Asian American theater and stories that are coming up now is that it's, as particularly from the mixed race perspective, is that there is that feeling of feeling othered by both cultures that you are mixed with, or whatever cultures you are mixed with, right? Because it's not only um, a it's different, right? Because with my body, my particular container for my spirit, right? It is considered all holy this, quote unquote,
Mm.
right? Whereas with mixed race folks, it's both, right? And that physical feeling of I don't know, mercury being that when it
Mm.
gets separated in something. I don't know. I'm
Yeah.
sort of on a little bit of a tangent there, but what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really, I would love that image of Mercury.
Right.
Yeah, it's such a, it's something I think about a lot, both in terms of like sort of how like Asian American experience has evolved. I've with Philadelphia Asian performing artists down here, we're doing a book club and reading Asian American Dreams by Helen Zha and like
Oh,
learning all that history as a community, which is really wonderful. Um, and so it really is interesting to realize like, oh, like how sort of newly like Asian American or any kind of pan Asian identity has existed, and there is this like really like vibrant redefinition still happening that it feels kind of exciting to know more about and be a part of. But the other thing that I've sort of done a bit of thinking about, though it didn't make it into this piece, is the way that even inside of mixed race experience, because it does have that sense of like alienation from both sides. I definitely feel that in my own lived experience for sure. And also sometimes exoticization,
mm-hmm.
exotifying from white folks.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that like even inside of mixed race experience, like what the two things are that you are mixed of is so different. Seeing the ways that like in folks who are like mixed black and white, or mixed indigenous and many other things, there's these different definitions. There's the one drop rule, which is super racist, which is right, you have any bit of African American ancestry, you're black. But on the other side, blood quantum, where you have to be at least 50% indigenous to count as indigenous, and the way that like white supremacy has specifically in certain situations decided to define mixed race identity and like how that line tips. And it's really interesting because mixed race Asian identity that I know of in the United States has never had that same kind of definition. And so there is this interesting place of like feeling like yeah, like often in Asian spaces, until relatively recently in my life, I didn't really feel a sense of belonging because I felt like I'm not Asian enough, right? That classic thing. And then on the other side, feeling like gravitating to white spaces a lot of the time, but then also noticing the way that like I would be exotified by them, the way that I'd be tokenized, and feeling like over time I've gravitated away from those as well.
Right. And I think it's sort of that function of white supremacy, right? They're always trying to define you by their terms,
Right,
right? As
exactly. And they just
opposed,
make up
right,
rules.
right, right, right. And just even I would even hazard to say that like the racist stuff that comes from the Asian side as well is also defined by white supremacy, right? It's always about sort of like the whatever about the this drive to assimilate, right, or drive not to rock the boat, whether they're Asian or they're Black or they're Latinx or any other ethnic or racial identity that is quote unquote whole, right, and that they don't. It's because they've been so threatened, right? They don't want to accept anybody who has even an inkling of being that, and yet, and yet it's. I always find it's like this really fascinating, uh, not trope, but it's a fascinating way that think. It's fascinating to have in work by mixed race folks, right? Of where they're really sort of exploring what it means to be both physically and sort of spiritually, mentally quote really in between worlds, right? In between more worlds, I guess. And I think it's sort of like the evolution too of like Asian American theater. I think that we're really in a good spot actually of creating these
Yeah.
really interesting new stories. Um, Again, if we're speaking with Joseph Ahmed, the incredible creator of Half Magic, again here on Mixed Asian Media's Mixed Asian Media Fest, the very first one. Please watch Half Magic. It is a fantastic, fantastic piece. Um, I I'm also really curious, and just really quickly, because I know we only have about 5 minutes left here, but I'm also interested in that sort of that dichotomy that happens too in gender, right?
Mm,
You've got two very different stories that are happening between your story of your father and your story of your mother, um, and in it, there's both things that they have kept from you. And again, not trying to, I won't try to spoil too much of it, but there is this sort of like theme of like, is it being kept from you, or is it because of the inability to communicate
mm,
between these folks who are of um, different origins than you?
mm.
Or is it both? Why not? Why not both?
Yeah, I mean that's a
Yeah.
really this is a deep one. This is a good question. Yeah, I mean it's I feel like it's a mix of different things. Like I remember recently I was talking to a friend who was debating whether to who's Indian American and was debating whether to like really work with her son on having him be able to speak Hindi.
Hmm.
And was like talking to a few of us and was like, "What do you think about this?" And I was like, "Please do, please do that."
Oh yes.
And it was interesting because it didn't have that same kind of stakes for her. And I think for me, it's one of these things where I think that like the ways in which like decisions were made for me, especially like in those formative years of the beginning of my life that I didn't necessarily have a say over yet, right?
Hmm.
And the way that that's impacted sort of the options I have in understanding my identity later in life have really affected me. Things like I wasn't raised speaking Bengali, um, and that is something that I wish I had because I'm in this place as an adult of like now in like really being invested in like learning more about that side of my culture that I had so much less of growing up, trying to learn the language, which is a lot harder as an adult, which I also talk about in the piece,
Oh
right?
yeah.
Um, and so there is this element of like uh, knowing that there were compromises made and that there were decisions worked out between these two people who had very different values about child rearing and about what
Hmm.
values, what religion I should get passed down. I also wasn't raised Muslim, which my dad is. There were a lot of decisions made early on that were complex, were really big decisions because of these differences between them. And in many ways, like as much as there is like a feeling of resentment in me or of anger or of loss about those things, I also know that like they were both in completely uncharted territory. Like they didn't know that I would be sitting here having this conversation and wrangling with all
Yeah.
those things as they were like deciding this. And it's funny because I do think in some ways there is this interesting sort of like in my particular family, this way that gender roles and socioeconomic class did sort of reinforce some of these like stereotypical things of like my dad being like out and working all the time, and like that was sort of his role, and my mother having the means to be able to be a stay-at-home mom. And
Hmm.
that also meaning that I got so much more of my mom's time, and therefore also ended up being raised with so much more of the white traditions of her culture and her upbringing because those were the things
Hmm.
that were more available to me.
I'm really interested in, particularly in the um, sort of the secrets that language tell, right? I mean, I've been fluent. I was fluent at one point in Spanish, and I just remember how wonderful it was to have that perspective that you'll only get from speaking another language. And
Mm.
yet, I can barely speak it now, and, right? And I miss that. And same thing with my parents' language, right? I don't. There's a um, and I go through, it's like you, have gone through periods in my life when I'm like, oh, I'm going to learn it, and I like do a big effort to try to learn parts of it, and I'll learn like how to count, and
Right.
then right, how to count, and then like it triggers certain things of like, I don't know, ancestral memory, or at least even just memory, right? Um, and knowing it at one point, I could always understand them without. I would always have to shut
Mm.
off that part of my brain that
Mm.
um, that listens with your ears, and I had to just sort of listen with my whole body, and I could understand what they were saying. But I don't even know that would even work now. But that was so touching about that part, because it was not in that part in the show. And I think something that anybody who comes from an immigrant family can relate to. In our last few minutes here, I know we're wrapping up here, speaking with Joseph Ahmed, the creator of Half Magic, here for Mixed Asian Media Fest. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, everyone. Tell us what you're up to in Philly. What are the next steps for Half Magic? And I know you described it as a piece in development, but it's pretty damn close, I have to say. It's really wonderful. Like, I'm so impressed by it. And what did you learn from this particular workshop, and what pieces do you think you might change in the next iteration, and where can we see it again?
Absolutely, that's great. So sort of general things that I'm doing, I'm a multi-hyphen, I do many things. I'm currently performing in a play with Shakespeare in it in a park in Philadelphia called QVK by the Philadelphia Artist Collective. I co-founded and run a company called Obvious Agency that creates interactive performance. You can check us out online at obvious-agency.com. For Half Magic, so I am finishing up the last steps of this mini residency with Philadelphia Asian Performing Artists, which is also a fabulous organization with a lot of mixed Asian folks in it that I highly recommend everyone checks out at phillyasianartists.com. And so I have one more, it'll actually be the first live in-person sharing of some of this work, because I began work on it in like March 2020 and the pandemic shut us down. So I will be doing the first half of the piece live and in person as a workshop showing as part of the Philadelphia Asian American Film Festival. That will be on November 11th at, I believe, 7 p.m. In Philadelphia, yes, at Asian Arts Initiative.
I will
travel up. More information. Yay! Awesome.
I will travel up and see that. Please do let me know about it. I just think it's a fantastic piece, and Joe, our audience, of course, does not know that we pre-gamed this conversation, right? And in that pre-game conversation, we started talking all about like what are the options for solo artists, right? With people with solo work. One of the things I did not get to you was a company called All for One here in New York City, which I really think you should look into, and various residencies and whatnot, because I think that there's, including the Orchard Project, and you should really go to Space on Rider Farm to do any of your work, because you're a genius, and propose any of your work. Right, these are all, and this is all sort of like my secret agenda too, to not always center especially now after the incredible 2 years we've been through, almost 2 years, good heavens, that we've been through, of starting to decenter New York as the be-all, end-all of art in this country, right? I think that there's some incredible art that's being done outside of New York, and it doesn't get near enough love, which is one of the reasons that I am just so impressed with Mixed Asian Media Fest. It's really gotten some incredible artists from all over the country here. And kudos to Alex Chester Blank and Michaela, who at Chernosky Holland, who have done so much work to bring this fantastic fest to everyone. Joseph, do you have a website that you can direct people to let people know about your work?
It's very simple. It's www.josephahmed.com.
Thank you, Joseph, and thank you for your beautiful piece. Say that one more time, just in case anybody missed it.
www.josephahmed.com. Thank you. This has been really like such a lovely conversation to engage with you about this work.
Joseph, you're a genius. I am so glad you got to that this piece got some wider viewing by everyone, by mixed race artists all over the country. Please let everyone know about this fantastic piece. And I hope that you will continue to watch Mixed Asian Media Fest and continue to follow Joseph's amazing work on his website. Thank you, everyone, and good night. Thank you so much for joining us today.